I think the coastal elites phrase is just as misleading as the flyover country phrase, because while they are coastal elites, one of them right now is the president, people who live on the coast are not by nature, elite. Like, we are all facing a lot of the same problems. I think sometimes in a region like this, you'll see problems like gentrification, much more than you will in a place like St. Louis, where the problem will be abandonment. It'll be a lot of empty lots. But I think in a lot of ways, we are all struggling with variations on the same theme.
Oh, I love it. Wow, a standing ovation.
Thank
I
y'all.
think we're among friends, Sarah.
Yeah, this is off to a good start. Thank you, San Francisco.
All right. Well, just making sure that the mic is on. Everyone can hear us. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, The Last American Road Trip with Sarah Kendzior. Tonight, we travel with Sarah across a fractured nation, exploring the unraveling of democracy, the erosion of truth, and the consequences of unchecked corruption, all within 1 hour. Sarah has long been a voice warning of authoritarianism and the turbulence in our government, and her latest insights are alarming and timely both. My name is Rachel Myrow, senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk. Now, let's get started. Joining me tonight is Sarah Kendzior, journalist, scholar, co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation.
Not anymore.
Oh, not
old bio.
Oh, old
okay.
bio. Okay, that's all right then. Until recently. And currently a best-selling author. She wrote The View from Flyover Country, Hiding in Plain Sight, and They Knew, as well as, of course, her latest book, The Last American Road Trip, a memoir. It's a deeply personal and political road trip through the heart of our homeland, and may I say, just a treat to read because you have such a way with words.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, I thought, Sarah, we might start at the beginning, your beginning, growing up analog in America, pre-internet, rotary phones, cassette tapes, so on. How do you think that influenced your understanding of America as a wee one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm in the last generation, I think, to have an analog childhood, and then the internet began to really take off in about 95, 96, when I entered adulthood. And so I have those memories, and I have the memory of, needing a map and knowing how to use a phone and all these other skills I'm attempting to teach my children. But a lot of it has to do with how distant a place felt, how until you actually visited a place, you wouldn't know what it would look like. You'd build up something about it in your imagination, and there's that sense of time and that sense of waiting and anticipation that I do think has been lost. Because what we've had since is, first this period where you're able to look up the answers to almost anything, and back when the internet worked, like a few years ago and whatnot, you could get a fairly decent set of facts to answer what you're looking for. Now that's been replaced by AI, by falsehoods and so forth. So we're almost going full circle to this time where, in order to really understand a place, in order to really understand our country, you need to see it firsthand. You need to see it through your own eyes. And so, I wrote this book, the main draft of it, in 2023. And sometimes I'm just amazed at how much technology has changed during that period up until publication, because so many of the places that I describe, you go and look for basic information about them, and you've got, Grok or some sort of Google monstrosity, spitting out, falsehoods by the second. So, yeah, it's part of the historical record now. So get that analog version.
Out of curiosity, as a mother, have you limited your children's use of technology? Have you said you're going to have to be X numbers of years old before you get to have a smartphone?
Yeah, well, I tried. I limit. Well, some of it was really practical, and this actually frightened me a little bit. I held off as long as I could for my daughter getting a smartphone, and then one day she was on a field trip, and they brought them to the wrong place, and she had no way to contact us because there were no payphones, and she was 11 years old. And so from that moment, we realized this was a necessity, and we tried to put some rules. But the main rule I have for my kids and the internet is that no matter what they find, when the algorithm brings up some kind of offensive content, they are always free to show it to me, and they will never, ever be in trouble for doing that. Because I think that, the mechanism is in place to try to radicalize and, harm and, in a way, brainwash youth. And I want them to feel free to just ask questions and be honest about what they've seen. And if they find it confusing or disturbing, to know that, they can come to me, for that kind of advice. And I'd encourage that for other parents because, kids are being exposed to a lot of, self-produced kind of scary stuff that I think sometimes can take them aback.
So back to your childhood again. How old were you when you started to think, hey, these history books are full of lies?
Oh, I don't know, 5. I mean, really, I don't know. I've had a kind of a skepticism. I actually write about this in this book, that I had this book about outer space and the future of outer space and how, Mars was going to be colonized by 2000 and all these sorts of dreams. And I would watch the years tick by through the 80s and 90s, and we'd be no closer to it. Of course, now the person that wants to bring us closest to it is a, fascist maniac. So that's really not offering some reassurances in that regard. But, I think a kind of skepticism is healthy. I think we're in a really interesting period now because, in part due to the internet, in part due to the wealth of information available on the internet, a lot of people reassessed their initial view of American history. And I think a lot of stories that were always there, they were always being told, but they weren't being taken seriously, were brought to light. And, and a classic example of this is people finding out about the Black Wall Street massacre in Tulsa at the centennial of it. And that's when they learned for the first time that it happened because, this was never in history books. Now we're in this backlash period, where we're seeing books censored. We're seeing, they're prohibited from classrooms. Libraries are having to pull them. That backlash is because people are trying to reconcile, the horrors of this country with their love for it. And I think a sort of a primal kind of defensiveness of it. And I think, what I've tried to do in all my writings, but especially in this book, is to show that those things can happen simultaneously. You can love this country, but you have to love it honestly. You can't whitewash it. You can't pretend that these atrocities did not occur, and you can't, ignore the fact that so many people get away with them and how those sorts of mechanisms happen. At the same time, this is a beautiful country. I love that it's full of so many, people from around the world, and that there's been contributions from so many different cultures. And, as we traveled around, because we were driving, we'd watch each place kind of merge into another one. My kids were able to see that firsthand. And so, that kind of experience is something I've always deeply appreciated.
Was there an inciting experience that really awakened your political consciousness as baby Sarah?
I'm not sure. I mean, I've always had kind of a eye towards darker things, but, but also how people survive them. One of my favorite books as a kid was A Wrinkle in Time. And, it is a book about authoritarianism, essentially, but it's also a book about conformity. And it's a book about the qualities that can help you when you are battling an authoritarian entity, which is basically imagination and love. And that book, I read it when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I think it's still my favorite book, and it's stuck with me a long time. And there's a passage in it that I've been thinking of for the last decade, where one character has been brainwashed by this authoritarian kind of supernatural power, and she keeps saying to the other one who's still fighting back, relax, everything's going to be fine, just give in, just calm down, you're overreacting. And, that was a early lesson to learn, is that the person who is, quote, overreacting is often the person who still has their moral integrity, who still has their compassion and has their love and their commitment to other people intact. And so, that should be heeded.
Funny, not funny that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people, since January 17th, January 20th, thereabouts, have heard this from our friends and loved ones. It's too toxic. I've got to lean out from all this news consumption. I've got to stop paying attention to politics. Periodically I might dip in when I notice my retirement account's shrinking, but, otherwise I just can't.
I think some of that is understandable because I think what people have been fed by the news media, particularly over the 4 years of the Biden administration, was a soap opera. And it was a soap opera of lies. It was the DOJ infotainment complex where you were regularly hearing, oh, of course, Trump is going to be punished for his multitude of crimes. Of course, his criminal cohort is going to be held accountable. Of course, we're going to get to the bottom of these things. And of course, he's not going to become president again because having a seditionist become the president again, like a mafia Grover Cleveland, is unthinkable. And then, of course, it all came about. And I think the fact that folks had turned into the news very frequently for an 8-year period, only to be met with that result, gave them, I think, a well-earned distrust in the media, and also just kind of an exhaustion in the soul of so many bad things happening once. Because, of course, this is not just about Trump and his administration. We also had to deal with a global pandemic. We're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with very rapid changes in technology, many of which, like AI, I think are deeply harmful. So, it's been a rough 10 years. I understand why, folks might check out of the minutia, of the little tiny details. What I'm hoping people don't check out of is what is at stake and the big picture and the suffering that, is increasing on a daily basis, and who in particular is suffering most in terms of, people being deported, people being detained. I hope that is not shrugged off, but that is often not what the media is covering. We're also going through a lot of chaos just in media. We have paywalls, we have algorithms, we have a real difficulty at getting information out, even about basic things. And we have an administration that lies. And I don't think that's truly a partisan thing. I think the lies are kind of, across the board, and a lot of crises that were preventable were played down. And because they were played down, they were not in fact prevented. And now we're living in that kind of aftermath. So yeah, I get why folks would check out to some degree. And I think that that's okay to some degree. And certainly it's a good thing to take care of yourself and, not let it, drive you too crazy. But I encourage folks to hold on to their morality, to their values, to check on those each day and make sure that that kind of sense of exhaustion doesn't translate into apathy about the fate of innocent human beings who are being forced to live in this very dangerous environment.
Well, I'm going to push back on you, perhaps because I'm, obviously structurally biased in this regard. But also, for my work, I read 2-3 hours of news every day from all sorts of different outlets. Media is not a monolith. It's not all New York and Washington, D.C. I read national papers. I read local papers. I read regional papers. You notice I'm not saying much TV. And there's a lot of great stuff out there, and a lot of reporters pouring their heart and soul into this, calling it like it is, and not just what's happening, in Washington, D.C., but where they live. And there are a lot of newsrooms that are shrinking and dying as people tune out. Should we be demonizing the media, in quotes, at this time?
I wasn't demonizing the media.
Yeah.
I'm demonizing the algorithmic and technological systems that block the media from being seen, from people, from being read. Because I think anyone who enters this industry now is doing it out of love, is doing it out of commitment, unless possibly they're on the TV end. But, if you're working in public radio, if you're working in a local newspaper, if you're lucky enough to live somewhere where a local newspaper still exists, you're making a very low salary. You're likely doing it because you care about journalism, you care about the truth, you care about your community, you want to get those facts out. And then structurally, though, everything is set against you. No one has ever really reconciled the paywall issue, because obviously people need to make a living. But when you're writing something and very few people are reading it, then what is the effect of it, in reality? A lot of people are, writing things on, like, for example, if you write for Substack and then you post it on Twitter, and no, I'm not calling it by the other name, it immediately gets gets banned. It gets shadow banned because of some beef between, Elon Musk and a journalist who was writing for Substack. And so suddenly, those links are gone. There's a lot of cases like that where a few people in the tech industry wield incredible power over all of that hard work. So my feeling of negativity about this situation is not directed, especially at the lower level journalists, the people really trying hard. It's at the way that it is structured to be delivered. It's the delivery method that I think everybody is suffering, the readers and writers alike.
We were talking in the green room just before this event that I posted about tonight's conversation on every major social media platform. And it was interesting to see which ones, Meta, where there was absolutely nothing, not so much as a like. And I've noticed this, with news articles that I write and post, that unless somebody is stalking me, which is to say friends and family, right? Like, I don't get any traction on those. And that's not what it was like 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like we're constantly having to deal with these changing conditions, and you feel like you've kind of figured them out. It's like a whack-a-mole kind of sensation where you learn how to move around it. And I do a lot of shameless self-promotion because I truly do not feel shame when I'm up against this Goliath of people trying to suppress my existence and the things that I put out there. Like, yes, I will retweet it, or I'm just going to keep on using that word over and over, and post it on every social media platform, and just try to break through that barrier, because it is structurally designed, one, to contain narratives, but also to push forward other narratives. And this was an annoyance, I think, a couple of years ago. It was a burden. Now I feel like it's becoming a danger, because what I'm also seeing is the deletion of all of the work that so many journalists have been doing basically since the dawn of this century. When a website shuts down, often all of those articles, all that information is lost. And if you look in the endnotes sections of my books, which are pretty vast, you'll see, maybe a third to half of the endnotes now lead into nowhere. So then my book becomes, the record of what happened. And then I look at people trying to, take my books out of circulation, censor my books. And I think, well, what happens when that's gone? And so, curation and archiving, I think, are, two of the biggest things that people can work on. And I'm always asked, what do we do? What do we do with all of these different crises? I don't know what kind of role to play. Everyone can help with something like that, with archiving, with curation, with preserving histories. We had a decade of, protest and, brewing revolution that we really hadn't seen in a long time. Everything from, Occupy to Black rights movements to Me Too to movements about gun control, climate change. More protests happened in Trump's first term than in any other part of American history. And they were live tweeted, live streamed, written in real time by ordinary people. And a lot of that history has now been lost. And of course, throughout time, this is always true. It's not like everyone who was writing, a diary in real time kept it and didn't just, chuck it away. But there's a effort, top-down effort, to constrain and to eliminate those narratives and to make sure that the people who've been fighting for their rights aren't able to have their works and their words preserved. And the thing is, if you don't keep your history, someone will rewrite it for you. I mean, I think it was Zora Neale Hurston who said, you have to, I'm going to horribly paraphrase her, but basically, you got to let them know that, they're trying to hurt you, or they're going to claim that you liked it, that you wanted it. And so that's one reason I've always encouraged people, write everything down, keep a record of everything that's happening, or they're going to write that record for you.
I love the humor in your writing. I'm so jealous of your X-handle, nonfiction horror writer.
Yeah.
Also, we share a deep respect for Mark Twain, the OG devastatingly funny pundit, skewering America's worst aspects. And I'm wondering what fellow pundits you admire for telling it like it is today.
Oh, gosh. I may pass on that. I mean, I don't know. Like, pundits aren't really folks that I read so much, in part because, you know, I like to read history and I like to read older stuff and I like to read people who, back when there was a functional media economy, you know, would be writing about similar issues of corruption on a regular basis. Not so much for this book, but for my previous book, They Knew. I ended up reading, you know, a compilation of Hunter S. Thompson's writing, and it wasn't the famous stuff. It was actually when he was writing in San Francisco, and he was writing, you know, weekly columns about things like Iran-Contra and the Reagan administration. And there was so much information in just those essays written in real time that had been lost. And reading that just sort of reminded me of what was once kind of standard in journalism. Not that he's really the standard. He always positioned himself as an outlier, but, you know, he was an accepted outlier. He was a popular outlier. Whereas nowadays, I think the desperation to even hold on to a job often supersedes the willingness to do that job properly. Because I think when journalists live in fear, and it's not necessarily like the top down, we're going to destroy the First Amendment, we're going to send you to jail kind of fear, but just fear of, can I financially survive on this job? Can I do this job? It inhibits creativity, it inhibits critical thinking, and that's a problem. And that's kind of left me with, you know, I'm not going to say, like, you know, there aren't folks that I like. There are plenty of folks who I read who are writing on similar issues as me, and I'm very grateful for their work. For some reason, none of their names are coming to mind. I just don't want to give the wrong impression, because I really do encourage people, you know, to keep writing even against these odds. But I often look more to the past than to the present or the future these days.
I'll admit, having recently slammed television, that I enjoy the work of Christiane Amanpour and the team that she leads, and gosh, all the comedians, Colbert, The Daily Show, you know, they are a bright spot.
Yeah, well, I wish that there was still, you know, that's another big change we've had, is this loss of like a pop culture monoculture. And that loss kind of emerged right when Trump got into office the first time. And I've always wondered if they still had that, if we weren't all watching everything, you know, split across a zillion streaming platforms, all of which you have to pay for individually. If we were watching together, like it was, say, during the George W. Bush administration, would people have come to conclusions that, in my view, were fairly obvious early on about what you know, Trump or just anybody, you know, Biden, whoever, was up to, because I think that sense of, you know, collective understanding is lost. Not that those people had all the answers, not that they were always right, but there's a long, long time in America where we're all kind of watching the same stuff at the same time, maybe having radically different opinions about the merits of its quality, but we all kind of, you know, were there able to have these back and forths with each other. That's kind of gone now. You know, people have trouble even knowing when a new show comes out, a new movie, a new book, you know, and I think that that's harmful. I think it's kind of eroded our sense of national cohesion, because I think, you know, our pop culture, it's a really important thing. You know, it's often kind of trivialized, but American music, American movies, you know, these are the kind of things that held us together, you know, even if politics or other things are splitting us apart. And I really wish that we could go back to it. I have great nostalgia for that time.
It's a funny thing, I suppose, gatekeepers, right? Whether you're talking about culture or you're talking about news, right? It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the internet has helped to spread information we were not getting when there were gatekeepers. But then on the other hand, you have this massive retrenchment away from facts and, you know, the rise of the stupid opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think sometimes there definitely are gatekeepers. It's just the people, you know, holding the gate, there are much stronger gates, and they tend to be coming out of Silicon Valley. They tend to be tech people much more than the traditional kind of, you know, like a Hollywood studio executive who wants to make, you know, the zillionth Marvel movie sequel instead of taking a chance on something, you know, more risky or creative. You know, I do think it's interesting that folks are now able to produce their own kind of, you know, movies and other content and stuff like that. But Yeah, there are still gatekeepers, but I do, the way I think of the internet, I don't know if this happens to you too, but, I feel like my parents, when they talk about Woodstock, like when I talk about like GeoCities or something, like I have this incredible nostalgia for that time because it felt revolutionary to just be able to talk to people who lived in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, to be able to create a little web page with HTML. I mean, it just felt so fresh and it felt so positive, and it's such a tragic thing. I think that it's led to this point because I don't think it was inevitable, but I think the belief that it was an inherently democratizing force is unfortunately what got us to this point, because a lot of those who warned about the potential of the internet to spread authoritarian, reactionary kind of politics, it was often dismissed, in real time until it was too late.
You were born and raised in suburban New Jersey.
No, I wasn't.
Oh, you weren't? Okay.
No.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I got that wrong.
It's okay.
Where were you born?
I'm from Meriden, Connecticut, which is in the industrial corridor between Hartford and New Haven. I live now in St. Louis. I've lived in St. Louis for a very long time. Meriden is a lot like St. Louis. If you take all the culture and libraries and parks and zoos and all that kind of stuff out of St. Louis, and then you leave the rest of St. Louis, and then you add steamed cheeseburgers, then you got Meriden. So, I grew up there, and I grew up there, at kind of the height of the crack and gang epidemics. I was somewhat clueless that all this was going on because I was a child. But what it did do, growing up there, is it made me appreciate small things. It made me appreciate very simple things about everyday life because the problems surrounding me were so enormous. And I think that quality has served me well. It certainly has served me well in St. Louis. But it serves me well as America becomes more like Meriden, more like St. Louis. We've been in this kind of downward trajectory. And so what I've tried to do is, to find beauty in the wreckage. And it's not that hard to do. There are a lot of wonderful places to see. I think that a lot of places that are dismissed or looked down upon are done so unfairly, and you just have to sort of try to see them in a different light, a light, with compassion, with empathy, and just with the sense of, the beauty of ruins and what's left behind, just kind of accepting that that's what it is and thinking about what that means for now.
What are the differences between Meriden and St. Louis?
Well, I mean, Meriden's like, 70,000 people. And St. Louis is a big city. I mean, a lot of folks get this wrong, but it's a metro region of, 3 million people. And one of the funniest experiences I've had, like my first book was called The View from Flyover Country, which is meant as a slight kind of at people who use that term. And I wanted to be like from. And by that, I meant the whole expanse of the middle of the country, which is extremely diverse. It's diverse demographically, diverse ideologically, but I get, I know this is NPR, but it really was NPR who did this, and I wrote about it. One person from NPR wanted to interview me about the book, and the first question they had is, what's it like living on a farm? And I was like, I live in St. Louis. And they're like, yeah, I know. And I'm like, I live in St. Louis. And so that there's just sort of a misperception, I think, that the whole kind of heartland is, one big John Cougar Mellencamp song. And I'm sorry, John Mellencamp song, gotta give respect. Whereas it's actually a huge array of people. And St. Louis in itself is like having, a ton of literally is a bunch of little cities pressed up against each other. But there's no one way to sum it up except for that, it is my home. It's my children's hometown. When a place is your children's hometown, you always see it, through the eyes of a child. And I love St. Louis, and I will, stand up for St. Louis, even if I may personally critique it from time to time. I'm always going to have its back.
What do you think coastal elites have to learn from a city like St. Louis? I mean, like you were saying earlier about the NPR journalist who was like...
That person should have just learned how to look up. I mean, the internet still worked back then, so they had no excuse. They were not talking to Grok or AI. They could have just gone on, a functional Wikipedia site. I don't believe in. I think the coastal elites phrase is just as misleading as the flyover country phrase, because while they are coastal elites, one of them right now is the president. People who live on the coast are not by nature, elite. Like, we are all facing a lot of the same problems. I think sometimes in a region like this, you'll see problems like gentrification much more than you will in a place like St. Louis, where the problem will be abandonment. It'll be a lot of empty lots. But I think in a lot of ways, we are all struggling with variations on the same theme. And there is an attempt by politicians, by officials, to try to bifurcate things into, categories of red and blue states, or, the heartland people and the coastal elites. It's often the Fox News anchors living in New York, living in Washington, D.C., and so forth, who are, yammering on about coastal elites. So unless you actually are, say, living in a Golden Tower in New York City, like, I don't really assume that a person is an elite, living large until proof is offered.
Is there anybody in politics, Republican or Democratic, who you admire or root for today?
No.
Do you think we're headed for civil war?
I very much hope not. And since I am coming here from flyover country to talk to all y'all coastal elites, I just want to make this clear that I do think there is a plot to try to lure us into civil war, and that this has been going on for a while, and that one of the mechanisms of this is what I described before, this red and blue illusion. These are categories that were created in the 2000 presidential election. They are not something that has been with us for most of our life. But I think what they are trying to do is, these plutocrats and oligarchs are the they in that sentence, is strip this country down and sell it off for parts. And I think they think that partitioning it is a quicker route to that, because what they're after is resource extraction and wealth. And they see people as just these sort of bodies that are in the way. And they would much rather have us fighting each other, because it makes their job easier. And I think the model for this is the oligarch pillaging and looting of the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, right after its collapse. And in those cases, the lines that were drawn were clearer, because they simply had all the former Soviet socialist republics, and then they became independent states, and the borders were clear. With the United States, I think they are trying very hard to kind of make Texas want to secede, make California want to secede, have some sort of West Coast alliance, and they're trying to build these stereotypes. But, Texas, I believe, had more Democratic voters than any other state, and California's got quite a lot of Republicans, and, every state is purple. I've been saying this line, since my first book, that America is purple. It is purple like a bruise. It is held together in our disillusionment and in our discontent. And so I don't buy into any of these stereotypes. I think they're very cruel. I think they're manipulative. I think they ignore people's actual life experience. And I don't want a world in which the United States falls apart and is divided. I think people have not thought this through, what this would mean to have to get documents and visas to visit your family, visit your friends. What would happen to our military? What would happen to police? But I do think there are people just floating on a cloud of money above us that do not care what happens to us on the ground. And they would be very happy to see such a war waged, because wars are always profitable, but a civil war in which this country simply ceases to exist would be profitable for them. And they would feel nothing. And this is where my frustration with a lot of our officials lies, because I see this very clearly, as I saw Trump coming to power very clearly. This is something they want. Doesn't mean it's inevitable. But they're not reacting with the urgency that is merited. And they have not been reacting with the urgency that is merited for a very long time. And I worry that it is going to come to that kind of boiling point, especially if the economy continues to crash, if people feel more and more desperate. They will scapegoat each other. They will buy into propaganda and lies. And I hope people don't do that. I hope people look upward and realize that that is where the problem lies. Your fellow man might be an asshole, but he's your like he's down in the slums, with the rest of us. This really is an issue of people being able to have an obscene amount of wealth, unprecedented in human history, far beyond even the Gilded Age, hoarding it over the rest of us, connecting it to technology that surveils us, and using it to abuse us. And it happened very quickly. And I think people need to extend, some mercy and some grace upon their fellow man who is just trying to get through this and have a little less excuse making for the officials whose job it is to prevent this and to protect us, but who seem to be, cheerleaded as if it's some sort of cult instead. I think we should be cheering each other for simply surviving this time instead.
Well, I think you've just dropped the mic there. Our conversation's over. How do you raise your children in such a way that they don't lean back in horror and resignation from the picture you've just described?
Yeah, it's fun having me as their mom. I mean, actually it is. You should read the book. It's fun having me as their mom. I think my kids, they harbor fewer illusions, but it's not through listening to my rhetoric. It's from, in part, growing up in St. Louis. It's from having things like a week off for Ferguson for the police to tear gas protesters. My kid, when she was in second grade, was sent home with a, quote, riot packet for the week. And then, after that, you get Trump and then you get COVID. My kids, all kids, have been through a lot. But I think when you grow up that way, and what I've tried to teach them is, again, to appreciate these small beauties in life. And so they are, curious kids, they're opinionated kids, they're very imaginative kids. I'm not a strict parent, but one thing I am strict about is things like AI or ChatGPT or any kind of automated robotic resource that is being used in place of critical thinking and inquiry. I want them to come to their own conclusions. I want them to write, to draw, and they like to do these things. So this is, works out very well for me. My daughter's a violinist. I'm glad that they have analog hobbies. I always encourage that for parents is, have your child have a hobby that if the whole grid goes down, if the apocalypse arrives, they will have comfort. They'll have something that they love to do and that nobody can take away from them. I think that's important for adults too, but it's particularly important for kids because technology is, pushed at them, I think, in a different way. They have no memory of the time before, whereas I'm the last generation that did.
You just, of course, anticipated my next question, which is, that search for mommy wisdom about what grown-ups can do to feel like we have more power in this situation.
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, what's interesting is I think you'll say the situation and everyone knows what you mean. And there's a million things that fit in this category of the situation. It's political turmoil, it's pandemics, it's climate catastrophe, it's rapid and negative technological change, and how to hold on to it. I've felt more and more like this is a moral battle. This is a battle for the human soul. This is a battle for our spirit, and it's, a culture of cruelty that is trying to erode our moral values and make us accept things that, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we would have never accepted, and make us less likely to be empathetic and to stand up for others. And so while a lot of people look at the traditional modes of leverage, things like elections or protests or something, and that's fine, it's good to participate in that. But I think that what it comes down to is they're trying to change who you are inside. They're trying to make you more like the AI that they so deeply treasure. They want to make you an interchangeable person, a disposable person, because that is how they actually see you. That is how they already see you. And so they want you to surrender what humanity you have. And the thing is, they can take a lot from you. They can take your job. They can take your money. They can take your rights, and that you should fight back, but they can try to take your rights. They can't take who you are inside. They cannot take your compassion. They cannot take your morality, and they'll never really know you. And so that's something that I've been encouraging people just to hold on to that, because you can only surrender that. If you lose that, if you lose your moral core, it's because you gave it up to them. So just don't do that. Don't surrender. Don't submit.
Talk a little bit more about the threats you see coming from AI. I think of musicians as the canary in the coal mine, but now AI is eating Hollywood, has eaten much of the news media, is eating book publishers on Amazon. starting with the cookbooks and technical manuals and expanding beyond that?
Yeah, I think it's part of this broader dehumanization, and I think when people are capable of creating, original work, when people bring that original work to a broad audience and it begins to challenge their own ideas, their own preconceptions, when we have something like a shared pop culture that we participate in and debate, that is threatening. That's threatening because what it does is it eliminates all these spheres of influence, and then the only one that's left is politics. I guess maybe sports, but I'm not so much involved in that one. But, the one thing that everyone is kind of forced to pay attention to because it's been so tumultuous is politics. And I think that contributes to the rancor because politics becomes gamified. People treat it like it's some sort of battle, like it's some sort of challenge about teams rather than, an erosion or a destruction of our basic rights. And so I miss our American pop culture. I deeply treasure it, and I refuse to stream music. I still have a Walkman. I have headphones. I'm just living like it's, 1991, and you're never going to take me out of that. And so, I hope that these things aren't lost because, I've traveled somewhat, outside this country, and I'm aware that many people outside this country think we're a deeply stupid country, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. But we're a wonderful, deeply stupid country. And I think a lot of things that people kind of shrugged off as trivial are things that we deeply miss when they are gone, like the golden age of television or movies that we all get excited about for Oscar night. And yes, the problem of gatekeepers is always an issue, but that's why we had, underground movies and independent film and independent journalism. And that has all been, that went away first, that was eaten away first. And now it's coming for the bigger players. And so I hope people keep creating, and I think really they always will. It's human instinct. I have complete faith, in my fellow Americans to keep producing incredibly unusual and weird and interesting stuff. It's just a matter of the distribution and the ability of others to see it and be influenced by it and be challenged by it. But I hope people never give up on creating it, because in that act of creation, you are saving a part of yourself. You're saving a part of your humanity, whether anybody, reads it or watches it or appreciates it or not. And I think that that's important in its own right.
Where do you look for the best writing, the best thinking today? I'm thinking, for instance, Substack. You're on Substack. Do you read other Substack writers?
Oh, yeah. I read a bunch of them. Sometimes it's just something that catches my eye. I have friends who I read on there. Substack has its own problems. This is the thing that's very frustrating to me, is that there's no kind of ethically pure platform. But at the same time, there are not no newspapers, but there are a lot of media outlets that have gone out of business, an incredibly large number, especially in the last 2 years. So of course, everybody's flocking to Substack because it's a place where you can make a living and survive. I make mine free. I don't do paywalls in times of peril. I think that that's immoral. So mine is completely volunteer supported. And I always try to support monetarily other writers who are doing the same thing, because I want that model to work. But yeah, I think there's good writing out there. I think that it continues to happen. I'm glad that people have kind of almost reverted to the age of blogging, which I miss. I have great fondness for that age. And another thing I've noticed when writing Substack, writing on Substack, is that the comments are just so different than the ones I see on social media. And I think in part because they're made by human beings. It's not just this endless memification, this repetition, people putting reaction gifs and so forth. They're thoughtful, they're interesting. And I think you see this also in newspaper comments. If you read them online, they're quite smart, and I think that people, I don't know, the expectation for people has been lowered, but people are still rising above it. And I think that that's a good thing to see.
It's heartening, isn't it? I want to make sure to get some of these questions in here. What is needed for America to reconcile and address its racist past?
Oh gosh, a lot. You guys got a few hours, few days, few years. I mean, I think one of the first things people need to do, and people were doing this until it was ruthlessly suppressed by right-wing backlash, is get an accurate understanding of history and to talk about things like slavery or Native American genocide as factual events that occurred, and that when you bring them up, it should not be some sort of innate controversy in itself, like how dare you bring up, this terrible chapter of history that makes me feel bad. Like, it's not about your feelings. It's about what happened, and especially about what happened to the people who were oppressed and what has happened to their ancestors and how that leads into today. And I was really heartened for a while, up until about 2022, when I saw so much of that. And I saw so many Black authors, Native American authors, and just creative people who weren't white being able to tell their own stories, and not just history. I was seeing shows like, Reservation Dogs. It's set in Oklahoma on a Native American reservation, being made, these incredibly creative, vivacious programming. And I thought, this is good. Like, finally, we're in an age where everybody will be able to tell their story in their own words. And it's not about, white people writing down what people from other backgrounds have been through. And now there's a complete backlash to that. You see it in the publishing industry, you see it in the entertainment industry, and you see it in the erasure of all of these articles online, some of which is coming from this administration, where they are literally eliminating, Black people, Latino people, others just out of history, deleting their websites. They sometimes bring them back after outcry. I think what they're doing is they are testing Americans. They're testing what they will put up with. This is a classic, Trump tactic. And so I think outcry against this, even though we know that it's, a method to piss people off, it is good to push back against this. It's also good to create a version of these stories, of these histories, that cannot be touched or erased by this government, because there's a long history of doing so. And I think they're really trying to go get back to those glory days that, honestly, the internet helped destroy that. The internet brought a lot of American history to light that had been buried, to a large extent, or at least underplayed beforehand. And it threatened people, because once you realize that it has happened here, that we have had selective autocracy, that net can be widened to include, most everyone. And that's basically the story of our country right now, is that it has happened before, just not to us all. And I think now we have a government that truly does not care whether we live or die, unless we are in that very, very tiny kind of billionaire class. And it's important to understand how people fought back, how they kept going, how they, preserved their culture within this, because, that is the American story.
How far are we from being collectively able to general strike? And would it even work?
That's a really interesting question. I think about this a lot, because historically a general strike is a really good idea. But what do you do with a general strike when the goal of this president, his stated goal for a very long time, has been to crash the economy and, fire everybody and get rid of workers and replace them with robots or, something kind of close to serfdom or enslavement? I worry about that. There's always the famous story of Reagan, firing all the striking airline workers. I think we might see that on a epic scale. So while I support the idea of strikes, they need to be very strategic, and people need to go into them with the knowledge that they truly don't care if you come back. You're striking for your fellow worker. You're striking on their behalf. So there needs to be mutual aid. There needs to be backup plans. The fact that our jobs are tied to our health care, makes this all the more dangerous, because they're very happy to cut that off as well. And so I think that on one hand, it's a good idea in the sense of collective action. You have to know that we're dealing with something new. It used to be a genuine threat when there were unions. That's why they worked so hard to get rid of them. I think now they just will, snap your fingers and replace you with some substandard AI machine. And that's in part because they don't care whether America internationally is a competitive country. They don't care if we're a loser on the international scene, because their goal is to just strip the country down and sell it off for parts anyway. So if, we're all jobless and struggling, they're kind of like, sure, whatever, we don't care. We'll bring in workers from somewhere else. It's an incredibly lawless and immoral administration of this, not going to respond in a typical way to traditional methods of dissent. I know, I'm fun. You guys are going to bring me back, right?
There's no coming back to it because you're speaking a lot of truth there. From where might credible political power to confront this crisis come from?
From you, from the people of this audience. I mean, the whole idea of credibility, respectability, we've seen people use that kind of, those words and that style to hide behind a lot of immoral, cowardly, action or inaction, a refusal to bring about accountability. The people I admire are the people who have kept going, even if they are ridiculed, threatened, ignored, in the face of this. So I think anyone who's willing to tell the truth about this situation, to stand up for people that are worse off than them, stand up for vulnerable people, never treat anybody's humanity as negotiable, which is a terrible trend I've seen emerging since the election, I think out of a state of panic, but suddenly, you're willing to, sort of shrug at the deportation of immigrants or at attacks on gay rights as if, oh, well, we can just, let them have that group, let them oppress that group, as long as they don't get the rest of us. You can't look at it that way. So when people see this as a struggle in which, nobody gets to be treated as disposable, then I think we have a very strong moral basis, because then people don't feel abandoned. And when people don't feel abandoned, when they feel like you've got their back, they will fight harder and they will feel safer and they will have a shared understanding of this situation that I think would be beneficial. So yeah, I think this is going to be a grassroots kind of answer.
Obviously, your independence lends you a certain confidence and courage that you might not have if you were, employed full time by some corporation. But is there any part of you that wakes up at 2 in the morning and worries about Trump and his minions coming for you?
Well, yeah, because they've been telling me they're gonna for like 10 years. It's not just Trump and his minions. It's like a whole lot of people and their minions. There's a lot of minions running amok, and they've got a target on me. I don't think of myself as like all that courageous. I get scared just like everybody else. Who wouldn't be scared in that situation? I just think that the worst thing I could possibly do is stop and give in. And it's in part because that would be the worst thing I could do as a human being. It would be the worst thing I could do as a parent, because I'm not really thinking about my own position in this. I'm thinking about what is going to happen to the next generation and to the generation after that if this keeps going. And so I feel an obligation that whatever I can do, and if my strength lies in doing research or documentation or things like that more than, organizing or activism or things where I have to talk to other human beings, then that is what I will continue to do, because I think it's the right thing to do. And sometimes it's just as simple as that. You just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and there's really nothing else to think about there.
You've done a lot of research, a lot of investigation into the way that other countries, I'm thinking in Europe, have dealt with authoritarianism, have dealt with oppression, have managed to effect revolution, at least temporarily. What lessons do you think that research offers us as Americans wanting to push this country in a different direction?
Well, I think there's a real useful thing to look at, which is what has happened in other countries recently where there was attempted coups, where you see the officials of those countries, say Brazil, for example, arrest the coup plotters and put them in jail instead of having them occupy Congress or become the president again. And so, there's a lesson to be learned here in what exactly is going on with our officials, particularly when you have a president who has been emerged immersed in organized crime or surrounded by, people who've been immersed in it for his entire life and who's been prone to use blackmail, bribes, threats, etc. We're dealing with a mafia state situation. So I think when you look abroad, the countries that are most useful to look at are the ones that are mafia states, places like Russia. And that is what I started out studying, by the way. Like my PhD in anthropology was on Uzbekistan, as a former Soviet republic turned authoritarian state. I did not think I would apply the knowledge I gained studying Uzbekistan to then, study the host of Celebrity Apprentice as he turned my homeland into a authoritarian kleptocracy. But, life has its twists and turns. I think it's useful to look at what exactly is wrong with all of our officials. And I don't just mean the elected ones. I mean ones in institutions. Of course, they've now been purged, many of them, so maybe they'll be more talkative now. And this climate of fear and sort of what leads to the sense of denial that this is happening. But while you can get books, I encourage y'all to read very broadly, to learn about things like, say, the trajectory of Putin's Russia, for example, how it changed over the last, I guess it's now 26 years of rule, because I think that is the model that they are going to follow.
Whew. So I go back to this question of how to maintain hope in a dark time. Take up a musical instrument or some form of creative practice. Get in the habit of talking to people again and not mediated through a digital device. Buy a book or two to support the author who writes the book. What else?
Yeah, people always ask me the hope question. I always get the hope question. I've been saying for a long time that I don't believe in hope, but I don't believe in hopelessness either. I think because sometimes it just depends on how you define hope. If you define it as a kind of inner fortitude against, very difficult forces, then good. Then that's a great way, in my view, to define hope. When hope becomes a wish, when hope becomes dependent on the actions of others, and we saw this in the kind of savior syndrome cult surrounding people like Comey and Mueller and Merrick Garland and other officials who completely failed the American people. That's a dangerous kind of hope because it's very passive. And so that's, again, why I encourage people, to take a stock of their morality, of their values, of their compassion, of the things that you can control inside, the way you treat people. That's something that you can always control, more than kind of, wishing that things could be better. You can do that too. But sometimes that can be a very painful wish. Sometimes I think that type of hope can be demoralizing because when it doesn't manifest, there's a crash. And that's when I think a lot of people tune out. I think that's what's led, like you were saying earlier, to a lot of people saying, like, I can't even watch this anymore. And it was because they had so much wrapped up in that external hope, this hope that they had no control over in terms of the actual situation. And, and then there's this American tendency to internalize everything bad that other people that are more powerful than us are doing and somehow blame ourselves for this situation. And I've seen a lot of that, blaming the voters, blaming the everyday Americans. And a lot of times it comes out of ignorance. They'll say, Americans aren't protesting. Americans are protesting. They'll say Americans aren't speaking out. We are speaking out. They'll say half the country voted for Trump. And I'm like, half the country didn't vote, and like by far the vast majority did not vote for him. People don't want these things. We don't want to live like this. But we have a punditry that often likes to claim that we do. We have officials because everyone's passing the buck. And I think now things are at such a, we've all lost our bucks in recent days. Things have come to such a disastrous point that maybe there'll be a more forthright assessment of this. I hope so. But, regardless of what happens externally, focus on what kind of person you want to be in this time. How you would think of the people whose opinion matters to you the most. Like for me, that's my kids. Like, how do I want to be remembered by them? How do I want to be seen by them? And then be that person.
One of my sisters talks about the way that children's bedtime fairy tales and Marvel and Disney and all these movies sort of educate us to want a hero. To, some, usually a white male, to stand up, with sword in hand and go out on, a quest to save the rest of us. And she argues, we're looking in the wrong place. We are the heroes. We have to be the heroes of our own story.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not, as I said, there's not anybody that I have any faith in terms of electoral power. That's it, and I don't even think that it's a matter of being heroic. I think it's just a matter of, having moral integrity and following through, even if other people don't like it, even if it maybe sets your career or material advantages back a little, even if it's risky. If you're doing the right thing, you'll have a kind of comfort in that. You'll have the knowledge about that. And, folks might say it's heroic. I think whether it is or not is almost irrelevant. We don't need heroes. We just need good folks. We need more good-hearted people.
You're sounding a lot like Woody Guthrie.
I do. I'll start. This is the sing-along portion of the show. So.
Since we are in San Francisco, what do you wish tech workers would advocate for, particularly those positioned to impact content policy and AI ethics?
Ooh, good question. Choice. I wish they would advocate for choice because a lot of times, we enter into some sort of thing like social media where we're accustomed to using it. Say we follow people and we see things happening in chronological order, and then suddenly it's just gone. And there's no way to revert to the previous mode, which is common sense. Like you follow the people whose opinions you value. You want to see things as they happen and not get a tornado alert, 1 month later put out of place. I mean, a lot of this is very dangerous. And we don't have choice in that. We don't have transparency either. And I think there needs to be a lot more transparency in tech. There are all these sort of consent agreements that people just click on. And then when you look at the actual document, it's like thousands of pages long. And of course, nobody's actually reading it. But that's how things happen, although I did not consent to this. AI has now swallowed, I think, all of my books. It's possibly even got its hands on the new one before you all did. But, it ate my first book. It ate my second book. This is some sort of creation that's swallowing up, well-selling books, I guess, without any consent from me, without any permission. And I've been told, by my publisher and by others, like, that's just the way it is. There's nothing you do about it. People want the choice to opt out of this. They want the choice, even like, you're in your car, you set a GPS or something like that, and suddenly it directs you somewhere else. And you're thinking like, what the hell? Like, I wanted to go this way. I wanted to see this thing. And there's a robot telling me what to do. And I've started to move away from technology a lot because of that, because it, for a while it was getting better, products were improving. They've all been getting worse, and they've all been trying to control us more. And I think that that's dangerous. And I think especially it's dangerous for younger people who might not even realize that that's happening because they weren't there for the evolution and the introduction of all these technological products.
You've done an amazing job predicting where we are now. Where do you think we're headed, given special elections, protests, and global criticism?
I mean, we're in for tough times, but I guess to comfort you, I've been saying that for a decade more, actually. I've been saying that for like the majority of this century. Granted, it's true, but I am still here saying it, and so are you. And so I think people are more resilient than they often give themselves credit for, in part because our crises are often played down as no big deal. Like, oh, that global pandemic, big, who cares? And a lot of people like to just put those things in the back of their mind because it's traumatic. It's painful. People don't want to dwell on it. But I think managing to just simply survive this time with your integrity intact is a feat in itself. And I do think that things have the capacity to get better. I think as things become more threatened, and in particular, I'm thinking of, our natural world, like our national parks, our forests, our rivers, et cetera. This breaks my heart to see all this happening. I'm seeing so many people people from all these different backgrounds, from all these different geographical regions, rising up to protect our country, to protect our natural heritage, our environmental heritage, and just, our clean air, our clean water. There are certain issues that everyone can kind of rally around. They lack the kind of contentiousness of other ones. And I think that, keeping our air and water clean, keeping our national lands protected is something that a lot of folks may cling to, and that might lead to, an embrace of other movements. And I hope that if anything comes out of this book I wrote, which I didn't realize, I wrote the book, in 2016, taking my kids around the country to see America on the occasion that it may end, trying to pack in as much as I could, national parks, historical sites, et cetera. To have it come out now when there is this overt attack, is really heartbreaking. And so I hope if anyone gets anything out of this book, it's inspiration to protect those sites even more, and to realize that, people cannot be stereotyped or generalized, and that, we need to look out for each other. That's the only way that we're going to get through this. It cannot be some sort of selective looking out. Everybody's needs need to be considered, and everybody's dignity needs to be respected.
With changes to the National Archives, hiring freeze, layoffs, how do you see the future of American history and culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I love the archives. I love any kind of archive. And that's why I wonder if there's going to end up being a kind of alternate archive. In a way, there always is. It's like how there's Howard Zinn. You know what I mean? Like, we've had a whole, lifetime of people putting forth the, quote, alternate history of America, which is often just simply the history of America. So in a sense, we're not dealing with a new problem. But we do have a top-down, destruction of our history that's very purposeful, that's very overtly political. And so I think there's a responsibility among people to try to preserve their stories. And the thing is people love to preserve their stories. Like, this isn't something that is a drag or that people don't enjoy doing. And I think most people, they like to hear other people's stories. They like to hear about other parts of the country and other groups. It's just a matter of finding a way to protect it. That's the issue that I wish, the good people working in tech could work with historians. And I know there are some projects in this direction to ensure that things are not digitally erased. Because in my most dystopian views, I worry that books will still exist, but they'll be digital only, and that, say, my own books with my name on it will be full of content that I didn't write, but the sort of brand will be on it, and people will think, oh, well, she meant that, this happened, she said that, because they trust me. And it'll all be, again, out of my control. When I see AI eating up my books, that's the feeling, I guess, this feeling of kind of panic and desperation that this is so fully beyond my control. So yeah, I think there needs to be more organization and collaboration, but I think people know that. I'm not saying anything revelatory here, but I hope folks continue in that direction.
Sarah, thank you so much for talking with us tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Fabulous conversation. And thank you all for your thoughtful questions. They've been terrific. Sarah will be signing copies of her book in the lounge outside the auditorium shortly. Finally, Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to return for future programs, to become a member, and support our mission of fostering civic education, engagement, and dialogue. You can sign up for membership at the front desk or online to receive discounts on tickets, travel opportunities, and more. To learn more, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much.